Hi, everyone. It's Marina Kukla here to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy for work success, CBTw, session 10, accepting and learning from feedback. So this week is a little bit different than the ones we've had previously, which really rely on some of our main strategies using the 4A's, some of our coping skills and problem solving. This is sort of a one-off framework that we're going to present today. The idea here is specifically in the work context, learning about feedback, learning how to effectively give and especially receive that feedback, and learning how to use feedback and make strides toward your work goals. We include this here in CBTw because we've found through our experience working with veterans in this population that this is really something that tends to trip them up at work, is getting that feedback and thinking about that and responding to it in a way that is sort of adaptive and helps either kind of maintain or further their work goals. So in other words, not responding to feedback in a way that really hurts them. That's what we're trying to get at here. And I think all veterans that we work with can relate to this. We've all gotten a variety of feedback, positive, negative, constructive, destructive at work, and then we have to figure out what we need to do about that. All right, so first we kind of lay the groundwork by going over the types of feedback, positive feedback being like a compliment, and then we kind of focus a little bit more on negative feedback, since that's the type of feedback that for most people tends to trip them up, or if they have a problem with feedback, that's where it lies, is with that negative feedback. So there's constructive feedback, which is a positive, a good way to give negative feedback when you have to give it. And then there's destructive or aggressive feedback. We have some education here that you would read aloud together as a group. And then we have a table that lays out the different characteristics of each to make it very explicit what these are. Then on page 95, we have our question to think about and discuss. We think about what positive feedback we've received, but then and then how we responded to that. And then we sort of compare and contrast that with the negative feedback that we've received. Was it constructive or destructive? Here, you might further help veterans understand the difference. I think just after introducing it here, like obviously some people will catch on quickly or they already know the difference, but for other people, they might not quite get it. And so continuing to kind of focus on that can be helpful. And then, did you respond differently? How did you respond to the negative feedback? Looking back, would you respond differently if the same situation occurred today? We asked this question because we found that a lot of people say, yeah, I responded in this way. I got in the guy's face or I confronted my supervisor, but I wouldn't do that now because that led to me getting fired or losing that job. But today, I would handle it more calmly. I would think about how I wanted to respond first, or I would go about it in a much more helpful way. And so that comes up a lot for people. And I think those narratives are important to look at what happened, maybe what went wrong, and how you've kind of grown or fixed that over time and how you would respond today. This is something that you would leave a few minutes for veterans to jot down some notes, and then you would come together as a group and discuss this. For veterans who don't have their manuals or their books with them, that's fine. They can just think about these and then just share with the group. But everyone, you would just kind of leave the floor open for people to share their responses. You'll get a lot of narratives here. They'll tell you about a past job and how this worked and what happened. This is a good opportunity for those behavioral reflections. One basic one might be for people who say, it's really hard for me to take feedback. You could just reflect that. It's really hard for you to accept feedback, or feedback can be confusing. And you've had times in the past where you've not been sure how to respond, or maybe you've responded in lots of different ways. Some of those worked okay and some of them didn't. So this is a good opportunity for a lot of behavioral reflection this week, basic and also starting to identify those patterns as they emerge. Then we have more education on 96, the obvious point being that sometimes all of us misinterpret feedback. These are sometimes linked with our mistakes in thinking, negative views of ourselves, and we might only hear negative feedback, or we might take something as negative or destructive when it's not actually that way. Maybe it's actually positive or constructive negative feedback. Sometimes we feel sensitive or vulnerable or just not very good about ourselves, and we tend to interpret everything around us as sort of this negative feedback in a bad way. We have some examples here. For example, my boss says, if you do this task like I showed you yesterday, you'll make less mistakes, but I might hear instead, you can't do anything right, right? So we can see our mistaken thinking there. And then this is kind of like a discussion about how we often misinterpret feedback. Then we get to our main sort of didactic of the day, where we offer this framework, which is a kind of a one-off separate framework for some of our others for steps for responding to feedback. We try to place it though within our 4A's CBT model. And this really involves all of the 4A's this week. And specifically for some people, it can be ACT, because we're actively behaving in a way that leads to better responses to feedback. So our first step is don't get defensive, don't immediately counterattack or bite back. Ask questions to get more information or to get clarity, connect with what the other person's saying, agree in some way, and restate the feedback. So the idea is not that we like fully agree with the feedback, or we're sort of acquiescing to it, or we're not standing up to that. I think some people will take, well, if I agree with it, I'm just backing down. I'm letting that person walk all over me, or they're wrong and I'm right. And it's not that. You're not saying, yes, this is exactly right, but you're just trying to get more information and connect with it in a way that kind of diffuses that situation or doesn't lead to defensiveness from either person. You're trying to find common ground so you can get it figured out. And so that's what we talk about here. Even if you think the other person's being unreasonable or wrong, you can probably neutralize your tone and come up with something that you can both kind of connect with or agree on, some grain of truth. And it doesn't mean that you're rolling over and playing dead. So that's kind of what I just kind of went over. You're simply acknowledging what that person is saying to you and how they see it. They have a different perspective than you. And then number 5 is compromise, suggesting some behavior change that you can meet the concern or address the concern that the criticism is speaking to. And sometimes it's agreeing to disagree or accepting the feedback, even if you don't completely agree with it. I think we oftentimes experience that at work, where our supervisor or someone else above us is telling us we need to change. We oftentimes don't necessarily think that's the best way to go about something, but we have to do it anyways. And so sometimes that's part of that acceptance piece as well. So we go through a group example. I believe there's an example in your folders. If not, you can do this together. When you have your feedback example, you want to lay out the scenario very clearly. Again, if you can lay out the feedback example, the scenario clearly, then the rest of the steps will clearly flow from that, and it will kind of minimize some confusion that can occur. So using your example, you can go through each of these. Don't get defensive. Let the person know that you're listening. Ask questions to get more information about the feedback. So you would write down questions here that you could ask. These could just be basic things. Connect with what the other person's saying. Again, these would be things that you could say, agree with the other person in some way and restate the feedback. And a lot of that's our reflective listening that we just went through. In order to be able to restate the feedback, we have to be listening closely to what was being said. And then compromise. What can you do in this situation to kind of address the concern or address the feedback or kind of make it right? How can you do this in a way that leaves your goal? For example, if your goal is to keep working at that job or in that career field, how can you respond to this feedback in a way that maintains that goal, maintains your sense of self? And sometimes we still feel wounded. We don't feel good about it, or we feel like it's unfair or unfounded. We just don't agree with it, but we still have to respond in a way that's helpful and adaptive for us and doesn't totally blow everything up. A lot of the narratives that veterans will share is that they responded to feedback, and maybe it was a series of feedback over time, but eventually things kind of blew up and they got fired, but there was a piece here that was difficult, and that's where things really unraveled and went wrong. So we really want to go through this, give veterans a chance, if they have their books, to write their own example. I think this is important because this is the only time we actually use this. Not that this doesn't come up, but in terms of using this framework, we're not going to use it in future sessions specifically. So leave them some time to write in their books, write their own example, and then at least jot some notes down here and then share with the group. I think this is a really important point. Even if you've gone through an example together as a group, if people don't have their manuals with them, have them think about this. And if they share a narrative of a time where they went through this, they can talk about, okay, based on these steps, if this happened today or if this happened tomorrow, and you were in a job like that again, and your boss gave you that feedback, your boss said that you were working too slowly or not doing it how he or she wanted, or some other piece of feedback, how would you handle it based on these steps? What are some things you could have said? How could you compromise? How could you try to connect with what she was saying, even if he or she misunderstood what the situation was? How could you clarify that to lead to a positive outcome? That's the idea here. So we want to give people a chance to try this out and write their own example down. That's why we save time for that, or at least think through it. If you're doing this over the video, you can share your screen of this page or of your example so that people can have that up, even if they don't have their manuals in front of them to look at it. And then, of course, our take home for session 10 is to work on this, to use this during the week and try to use these steps and see how that works, even if it's small feedback or non-work related feedback. I mean, it could be something a family member says, or your neighbor, or somebody on the bus, or your landlord. It could be any type of feedback that you get from your voc rehab counselor. So working on any of these steps, or even just considering how you might respond to feedback in a more helpful way. Then we ask people to, as a process-based item, to kind of note, was it easy? Was it hard? Did it work out? Were you able to do it in a way that was effective? And then what was the outcome of the feedback then? What happened after you responded in a different way? And so that's that they might jot notes down here, and that's what you would talk about during your homework or your take-home review at the beginning of session 11. As I already mentioned, continue to use those behavioral reflections. When you hear those thoughts, use those cognitive reflections, identify them as such. There will be a lot of thoughts shared, even if veterans don't recognize, this is my thought about that situation. This is a good opportunity for you to pick those out, to listen for those and reflect those back using first person, using quotes. For example, you were thinking in that situation that your boss was being pretty unfair to you. That would be a thought. Like, my boss is being unfair to me, screw this job. So you're thinking to yourself, screw this job. Why should I work here if my boss is going to give me this kind of feedback, every day that I don't agree with? So listen for those thoughts, definitely listen for those behaviors and those behavioral patterns, and work on reflecting those back. Hope it goes well. Thanks for watching this video.